In this Diablo 4 video, I'm going to be showing you my Marksman build. This is a level 70 plus rogue build that focuses on the use of rapid fire and is aimed at world tier 4. And this is sort of an evolution of the frozen or freezing rain build that you saw from world tier 3 and the evolution of the cold archer rapid fire build. So generally what's changed from the previous version of the build is that even though I'm still using cold in this build, you're free to use whichever element you want, whether you want to use poison or shadow. I'm going to show you how to set up for that so that you can use whichever element that you want. And the focus of this build is really more about critical damage and vulnerability and how to get a lot of damage out of rapid fire. And then the element that you choose is sort of the icing on the cake. So we're employing a similar strategy that we did in the World Tier 3 version of this build, and we're using the exploit glyph. This time I have moved it to the first board, and we've taken every single strength node we can here to further boost our vulnerability. And as if you remember, every time we attack an enemy, we're going to set vulnerable for 3 seconds. And what's great about this is we've taken the upgrade of rapid fire that makes it so that we gain 15 energy back every time we hit a vulnerable enemy. So we don't have to use any basic attack on this build. We have no energy management issues. We don't need any sort of rings or equipment. That's going to further boost our energy regeneration. So we're free to just kind of fire at will with rapid fire. And essentially what this build has done is it's focused on vulnerability and critical damage, because those are the two most important things you can do to get damage out of this build pretty much. So first of all, let's talk about vulnerability and how we accomplish that. So you want to try and get as much vulnerability as possible as you can. So I've taken all the strength nodes around the exploit glyph in order to get as much vulnerable damage there as I can. And I'll obviously keep upgrading this glyph in order to get more vulnerable damage as time goes on. But another great way is by using a crossbow. Crossbows come with vulnerable damage on them by default. I did not get a good one in my time playing, so I'm using a bow, and I have managed to roll vulnerable damage on it. So if you are using a bow, make sure that you do get vulnerable damage on it. But ideally, you'd have a crossbow that has vulnerable damage on it by default. And then you would roll vulnerable damage even more on top of it. And besides vulnerable damage on your weapon, you're going to want to look for critical damage. And you're also going to look for core skill damage, and ideally like dexterity or something like that. Those are really what you want to look for on your weapon, and you want that to be on your swords as well. And you want swords because swords are going to give you critical damage, whereas daggers are going to give you damage to close, and you want that critical damage multiplier. So you're going to be looking for critical damage on swords with the same modifiers: vulnerable damage, critical strike damage, damage to distant, dexterity, etc. And you also want to look for these same things on your jewelry. Now on your jewelry though, you can obviously have critical strike chance as well. That will help with your damage. So you may want to add critical strike damage or critical strike chance there as well. But you definitely want vulnerable on your jewelry if possible, or at least on your rings. I don't think you can get it on your amulet. So then for our second Paragon board, we've taken exploit weakness, which makes it so when you deal damage to a vulnerable enemy, they take increased damage from you. That's the legendary thing there. But it's really the passive rare nodes here that we want. We'll obviously take this as well because this is not bad. You hit enemies over and over with rapid fire, particularly elites and bosses. So that's great. But it's the other rare nodes in here that we want. For instance, Artifice, which makes it so that you have increased vulnerable damage. And if you have 270 strength, then you're going to get 20% vulnerable damage. This also gives you 10 dexterity. This is fantastic. Hunter Killer here is also a really good node here, increasing your damage to elites and increasing your movement speed after killing an elite. And if you have up to 345 dexterity, which you should, then you'll also gain an extra 16% damage to elites. That's a huge amount. And then also the rare node Exploit gives you 20% vulnerable damage if you meet the extra requirements there. And it also gives you damage to injured enemies. These are enemies below 35% health. So those are the ways that we gain increased vulnerable damage. And obviously, as we attack enemies, we're going to apply vulnerable. But you only have 3 seconds for this to apply. So really, you want to try and burst enemies down as quickly as possible. That means if you start attacking an enemy, you want to try and focus it down. You don't want to try and hit everything on the screen over and over and over. Otherwise, you'll just weaken it, your vulnerable will wear off, and then you'll have a hard time killing enemies, because we are really, really focused on vulnerable damage. But something you can do to boost your damage when your vulnerable is down is, for instance, if you're fighting an elite and that 3-second time you didn't kill them, you can hit concealment. I've actually swapped the upgrade here from the one that gives you a guaranteed critical strike when you come out of concealment to the one that puts vulnerable for 6 seconds on the enemy that when you use the skill coming out of concealment. So if you can't finish an elite off in that time, pop concealment. That's going to give you energy, and it's also going to make you invisible for a couple seconds. And then you can use your imbuement or whatever, and then you can go to town on an elite and finish them off with 6 more seconds of vulnerability. And this works really great during boss fights as well, because you're going to a boss fight, get 3 seconds of vulnerability, pop Concealment, get 6 more seconds of vulnerability on a boss. Pop your ultimate, then you should be able to pop Concealment again and get 6 more seconds of vulnerability, and that can keep vulnerability up on a boss. Pretty soon, a few seconds after that, you'll gain vulnerability again from attacking. Hopefully your boss is dead by then, but this is a great way to keep vulnerable up, particularly on elite, if you need to burst them down really quickly. So what glyph you put in that second Paragon board is really going to be determined by what, imbuement you're going with. For instance, if you're going with cold, like I am here, I have put the control glyph there, and we were able to get that up to 110% damage to crowd-controlled enemies at level 15. That's a lot of damage against crowd control. That means when you freeze an enemy, you're going to get that 110% damage. Plus, you're going to get increased damage to Frozen. Plus, you're going to get the increased damage from the Frigid Finesse passive. So that's a huge amount of damage for you when you freeze an enemy and you go to town on them with that. But if you're playing Poison or you're playing Shadow, then obviously this one isn't going to apply as much to you because you're not really crowd controlling enemies as much. So what I suggest doing here, if you're going to use either Poison or Shadow, is use the combat glyph, and this is just going to increase your critical damage, so with your core skill, which is rapid fire in this case, but you'll need it to get it up to 15 in order to really take advantage of its full effect, its bonus effect rather, and be able to get enough nodes to really boost up your critical damage. So make sure that you're leveling up combat if you're working on Shadow or you're working on Poison. So for the next board, I've taken Tricks of the Trade, and I don't actually want the legendary node here. I don't really care about that, but there are a lot of good rare nodes here, and I'll show you what these are. First of all, you have Havoc, which just increases your critical strike damage and your physical damage. All your shots you fire that are not imbued are going to be physical damage. So this is really good for any build that uses rapid fire. You use rapid fire all the time unimbued because you just put vulnerable and kill enemies really quickly. So this is not necessarily bad, even if you're going for Shadow or Poison. And also when you meet the additional requirements, you'll gain even more critical strike damage, which is great. Additionally, there's another node here called Focus that gives you more damage to elites, and if you meet the secondary requirement, it's up to 32% damage to elites. So that's 64% damage to elites between both this and the other node from the previous tree. That's a lot of damage to elites. It means you're going to be able to melt them. Brawler is also not a bad node here. A lot of times when you're playing solo, you need to deal damage to close enemies. You just cannot get far enough away, and it also has damage reduction to close enemies, which can help keep you alive, which is great. And then up in the corner, you have Ranger, which increases your damage to distant enemies and also reduces the damage you take from distant enemies. And this is great because most of the damage you deal is to distant enemies. Anything outside of melee range is considered distant. So this is another really good node. And these are really the nodes you want in the tree. You don't really care about anything else besides the glyph socket. And what glyph you stick in that third board is really going to be determined by what style of play you're going for. For instance, if you are playing cold like I am, then you'll probably put combat here because you have control on your second board. However, if you're talking about something like Shadow Imbuement, you'd probably want to take Infusion, which makes it so that imbued skills deal increased damage. Because with Shadow, you really need to get that damage as high as you can with those Shadow attacks in order to cause those explosions, which then cause chain reactions. And if you're talking about Poison, you would probably put Bane here, and that makes it so that you deal increased poison damage and have a chance to deal double the amount of poison damage. So that's a really, really strong one. And you can just, choose which glyph you want. You'll have to level these up to 15 in order to get them in there, I think, in most cases. But at this point, you should be, your character is not progressing fast at gaining Paragon points. As you're approaching 80, you really start to slow down. So you should have plenty of time to level up these glyphs while you're getting to that third socket. So talking about equipment here, I'm still using the Cowl of the Nameless. This gives you dexterity, cooldown reduction, which is great for imbuements and also for your ultimates and any other skills you're using like concealment and smoke grenade. Also gives you crowd control duration. This works really well because I'm using frost. If you have any crowd control at all, that's great. It gives you maximum energy so you don't run out of energies easily, and it also gives you lucky hit chance against crowd control enemies. You could probably replace this if you're not playing a cold archer with some other helmet that gives you bonus to skills or max energy, cooldown reduction, and other stats or something like that. You don't necessarily have to have this. Is much better for a cold archer than it is for a Shadow or Poison. And then on my chest piece, I have focused on physical damage, marksman skill damage. These are great for rapid fire because again, you're not imbued all the time. I've got total armor on there, damage reduction to close enemies. These are all good, and I've imprinted with damaging vulnerable enemies with a core skill has up to a 20% chance to give you a healing potion. I find this really, really nice. This happens all the time. You could also use a damage shield here with Aspect of the Protector if you want to get some more damage protection. And then for my gloves, I'm still using Grasp of the Shadow. This gives you attack speed, more vulnerable damage. Again, you need all the vulnerable damage you can get. Makes it so your Shadow Clone damage is increased, which helps sometimes because of the proc of the Shadow Clone from the ability of this thing, but otherwise we're not really using Shadow Clone. And also +3 ranks to your core skills. This is huge. That's going to give Rapid Fire +3, and you know, one of the reasons to use a regular, you know, glove or a rare glove or a legendary glove that's got a custom aspect on it is because of those ranks to core skills, and you still get that here, so that's really nice. And then the ability on it makes it so that when you damage a vulnerable enemy with a Marksman or Cutthroat skill, you have a chance to summon a Shadow Clone that mimics your attack. So that's really, really good for this because we're damaging vulnerable enemies all the time. On the legs, I have Aspect of Disobedience. That basically just increases your armor. I have total armor on there. I've got Imbuement skill cooldown reduction to help get my Imbuement back off cooldown quicker. I've got damage reduction while injured. Any other damage reduction would be good here, or dodge chance to help mitigate damage. For my boots, I've used the Frostbitten aspect. That makes it so that chilled enemies that get hit by my smoke grenade have a chance to be frozen, and also we deal up to 25% critical strike damage against frozen enemies. It's really nice for a cold build, not necessarily needed at all if you're playing Poison or Shadow. We've also got ranks of Caltrops on there, dodge chance against distant enemies, movement speed, all stats, all good things for boots. You could also use Penitent Greaves here, which is a unique item that makes it so that you basically create a frost trail when you walk that chills enemies and increases your damage to chilled enemies. So if you're moving through enemies a lot, you can, you know, crowd control them easily, which will obviously then increase your damage against crowd control enemies. When it comes to your bow here, again, you're going to want a crossbow. I wasn't able to find a good one that had high enough item power, but I found a really good bow. Because you want that extra vulnerable damage, and you want to look for vulnerable damage on it, critical strike damage if possible, dexterity if possible, and then anything like damage to distant enemies or damage to close enemies, depending on, you know, whichever, damage to crowd control, something like that to increase your damage. And you want to imprint this with the rapid fire aspect, or the aspect of repeating. That basically makes it so that when you use rapid fire, it has a chance to ricochet. And you want this on your bow ideally, because you can get up to 90% chance for it to ricochet, meaning that like you're going to get 5 ricochets if you fire it, which is pretty good in my opinion. Now, if you happen to get Wind Force or Sky Hunter, which can both work well in this build, you would definitely want to put Rapid Fire probably on your amulet, or you're going to have a very low ricochet rate. Like you could put it on a ring and have 45% if you max rolled it, which still isn't terrible. It means you're probably going to get, you know, half the ricochets you would get, which isn't the end of the world with Rapid Fire, but if you put it on your necklace, then you'll have even higher chance. But the problem with that is, if you're using Word of Khan, then you can't put it on your amulet. So if you're using Word of Khan, you'll have to put it on a ring, otherwise you'll put it on your amulet. And the problem with using Sky Hunter or Wind Force, again, is they don't have vulnerable damage on them, and because with a crossbow you can double dip on vulnerable damage, it's always probably going to outperform these. I haven't tested it to see, but that vulnerable damage is so strong that it'll likely outperform it. Now, Sky Hunter has critical strike damage on it, so it might be closer than Wind Force, but you'd have to mess around with these and see how much damage they actually do. Sky Hunter is going to give you energy back, which you really don't need for this build. I mean, it's not like it's going to hurt you, but you don't really need it, so Wind Force is probably better with its ability, but Sky Hunter is better with its critical strike damage. So then on your swords, you're going to want to make sure that you have vulnerable damage. You want swords again because they have critical strike damage on them. You want vulnerable damage. You want to roll critical strike damage, core skill damage, and dexterity if possible, or damage against distance, something like that. Crowd control's not bad if you're running like, you know, Frost or something. And I've got the Vengeful aspect on 1, which makes it so that making an enemy vulnerable has up to a 50% chance to grant 3% critical strike chance, up to 9%. This happens all the time, so you're going to get, like, you know, at least 9% critical chance constantly with this, which is great. And then on the other sword, I have the Accelerating aspect, giving me 25% increased attack speed when I critically strike, which is constantly, so I'm going to fire rapid shots faster, which is great. And then on my rings again, you're going to be looking for vulnerable damage, critical strike chance, critical damage, stuff like that, damage to distance, something like that. Maximum life is not bad either. But one aspect I have here is Smiting aspect, which makes it so that you have up to a 20% critical strike chance against enemies below 35% health. And also while you're over 80% health, your crowd control duration is up to 40%. Which is great, because in this case, because I'm playing a Frost build. But if you weren't playing a Frost build, I would recommend replacing this. And you would definitely want to replace this with Aspect of Corruption, which makes it so that your imbuement skills effects have up to a 40% increased potency against vulnerable enemies. So if you're using Shadow, this is going to make them hit harder, and if you're using Poison, that's going to make more damage on Poison. So this is really, really good for those. It's not so good with Cold, because you still chill things and freeze things really, really quickly, but if you're talking about damage, you want more damage out of it. that's a great replacement. And then on my other ring, I have the Edgemasters aspect, or you could use Intercom aspect, either or here. And essentially what this is going to do is the Edgemasters aspect makes it so that when you have higher resource, you're going to deal more damage, which happens all the time. You barely go down in resources at all for this build. This is kind of like getting disabled on and off, so I'm not sure if it's working properly right now. You might be better off doing Intercom at the moment. And Intercom gives you up to a 30% damage increase the longer you stand still while firing, which happens a lot with this build. So it's a great way to increase your damage too. And then on the necklace, we have Word of a Con here, which makes it so that you basically have all imbuements whenever you use Rain of Arrows. If you're not using Rain of Arrows and you're using Shadow Clone, you can replace this with something else. But I really, really like Rain of Arrows on this build, and I don't think you should use Rain of Arrows if you're not using Word of a Con. So that kind of wraps up the Marksman build. I hope I showed you guys, through the trees and examples of how you can change the build up. The general concept of this build is the same no matter what imbuement you're using. You would just change your aspects slightly to accommodate that, imbuement that you want. And you could even set yourself up in a way that you kind of have a general setup. That way you can switch on the fly with, just respecking a couple points into the different imbuements and save yourself a lot of gold, and you just mix it up on the fly if you want. Stay tuned for more Diablo 4 build guides as we continue on our 70+ builds.